Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our 7th bi-monthly Ask Me Anything live video series. If you missed the 6th, Being a Philly Neighbor with Olga Livshin and Lunarda Zemzem, you can still see it on HIAS Pennsylvania's YouTube page, on our website, hiaspa.org, and in the video section of HIAS Pennsylvania's Facebook page. My name is Cathryn Miller-Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of HIAS Pennsylvania, a nonprofit whose mission is to provide legal and social services to immigrants and refugees. Today, our conversation will focus on how could the Supreme Court affect DACA. Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the name of a program created by President Obama in 2012, also known as DACA, protects nearly 700,000 immigrants from deportation. While it provides work permits, it does not provide a path for citizenship. Thanks to everyone who's submitted questions already. We're excited for our conversation today. If you haven't already done so, please submit any questions you have during the next half hour in the comments section below. If we don't get them during this live conversation, we'll answer them in the comments. We'd also love to hear your ideas on topics for future videos. We hope that through this video series, you can ask any questions you have and learn the truth about immigration and refugee resettlement in the United States. Today, we're excited to be speaking with Sarah Paoletti. Sarah is the practice professor of law and the founder and director of the Transnational Legal Clinic at the University of Pennsylvania. In the Transnational Legal Clinic, Professor Paoletti and her students address human rights issues through cross-cultural and international legal advocacy and representation. Professor Paoletti's research focuses on the intersection of human rights, migration, and labor law, and she has presented on this theme before the United Nations and the Organization of American States. Professor Paoletti and students from Penn attended the rallies outside the Supreme Court hearing about the DACA program on November 12, 2019. So I'm going to start with a few questions for myself. Can you explain to our listeners what is the DACA program and how did it come to exist?
Sure. So DACA, as you said, is Deferred Action for Early Childhood Arrivals. And it is a program that was created by President Obama in an exercise of prosecutorial discretion to grant lawful presence, right? Not a firm status, but a lawful presence to individuals who had come as children and who are sort of longstanding members of our community and for all intents and purposes really are American, right? They are part of our country and part of our communities and part of our schools. And this was a sort of response to trying to deal with the fact that Congress had failed to pass the DREAM Act, right, which had been introduced now almost more than a decade and a half ago, to provide a pathway to citizenship for these youth in our country, which had wide bipartisan support, but just never managed to make it over the finish line. And it was part of President Obama's overall attempt to really provide some degree of security, recognizing that we have anywhere from 11 to 12 million undocumented individuals in this country. We don't have the resources, nor do we have the will or the desire, nor is it in our interest to deport all 11, 12 million of them. And so rather than have people continuing to live underground or have to live a second-class, second-tier status, we should recognize and celebrate those individuals who are important members of our community. And so it was his lawful exercise of prosecutorial discretion to say, I will recognize that you are here if you apply and you pass rigorous screening, criminal background checks, you've graduated from high school or have a GED, served in the military, and then there's sort of requirements in terms of age when you arrived and how long you'd been here. We will recognize you as being sort of lawfully present in the country. We'll give you work authorization. You can get a driver's license and be able to pursue higher education and employment and continue to live the promise that you have.
Great. And so it was lawful presence, in other words, means protection from deportation, right? Because they're lawfully here. They're declared to be lawfully here.
Right.
So wasn't the DACA program ended in 2017? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So on September 5th, 2017, which was the first day of school for us at the University of Pennsylvania, Jeff Sessions had a press conference and announced the intent to terminate DACA. And he was going to give a 6-month grace period until March 5th, 2018, before DACA would officially terminate. And at that point, litigation ensued, right? And so there was litigation, there was an injunctive order, and the result of that was that no new applications are being processed because, again, this wasn't an exercise of discretion, right? And so they terminated the program, but there was a recognition that you can't just take it away from people who have come out of the shadows, applied, right, put themselves before ICE and said, here we are, or put themselves before Homeland Security and said, here we are. And so the courts enjoined the termination of DACA for those who already had it. So people who had DACA at the time have been able to continue to renew their DACA status, and now they're somewhere between 700, 800,000 people with DACA status still.
Great. And that between 700, 800, that number was true back when the termination order happened, right? Or the
right,
attempts to terminate the status.
It was probably about 800,000.
Right. And so that number has remained steady. And those 800,000 people, are you aware of where they are? Are they working? Are they in school? Are they?
So they're everywhere, right? They are in our universities, serving in our military. They are working, members of the bar, members of the medical profession, and teachers. There's
workers.
A large number in Teach for America was one of the first big programs to employ DACA recipients. And so, yes, so they are in sort of all areas of industry and education.
And so if the injunctive relief hadn't prevented enforcement of turning it away, then those 800,000 people would essentially have been deported, I assume.
Well,
right?
So nobody can be deported without a hearing, right? So that's the important thing. And so, so unclear, right, how the termination would have transpired, right? And it's something we're facing now, right? Unclear, depending on what happens. Again, we don't really have the capacity or the will to deport them. And so when you're looking at 800,000 individuals who are contributing to the economy, contributing to their community, contributing to their families, contributing to our academic institutions and all the rest, right? They're not the people that we want to deport. Now, there have been some deportations of DACA, denials of renewals and deportations of DACA recipients in sort of recent years, and whether those have been retaliatory or not, or what the motive is behind those terminations is unclear. They're not terminations or denials or deportations for people with significant criminal backgrounds, right? And so I think that's a cause of concern. But the reality is you can't just deport somebody, right? If they've been in this country, first, it's the obligation of the U.S. government to prove that they are not lawfully present and that they are deportable. And there has to be a finding by an immigration judge that they are deportable. And then once that determination is made, there is an opportunity for individuals to apply for relief. So they may have other forms of relief available to them to stay in the country.
But one of the problems is, just a side note, and then I'll get back to the Supreme Court. Do DACA recipients or any immigrants have a right to lawyers?
So yes and no. There is a right to a lawyer. It's actually written as a privilege. You have the privilege of legal representation in immigration proceedings, but you do have a right to an attorney, but not a right to an attorney at government expense. And so the reality is, for the majority of individuals in immigration proceedings, getting access
including DACA
recipients, getting access to legal representation is incredibly challenging, right? Because DACA recipients, while they may be able to attend college and work to pay for college, they are not eligible for federal grants, right? They're not eligible for a lot of the money that is available to most students. So they are often paying their own way, unless they're fortunate enough to go to an institution that has a lot of resources for a lot of scholarship funding, right? And so resources for attorneys is difficult. And when you get outside of major urban areas like Philadelphia, finding legal representation becomes that much more challenging.
Okay, thanks. So let's turn more to the Supreme Court now. I was hoping that you could explain to our listeners what the arguments were. What was the government arguing? What was the University of California arguing?
So on November 12th, the Supreme Court heard arguments in DACA and the challenge on the termination of DACA. And the government's argument was interesting, right? I mean, I think on both sides there's sort of this line. The government's argument was that it was entirely lawful for them to terminate DACA, and that the court does not actually have jurisdiction to hear this because this was exclusively within their power of prosecutorial discretion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, sorry. It was exclusively within their power to terminate because the program wasn't lawful in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were arguing that the program was an unlawful exercise of prosecutorial discretion by President Obama. At the same time, they're saying, assuming the court does have jurisdiction, then we have discretion to terminate it, right? So they were sort of arguing both sides of the discretion argument. President Obama didn't have discretion to issue it, but it's within our discretionary powers, so we can terminate it. And at the University of California, joined by several private individuals, DACA recipients themselves and other institutions, and this case had more amicus briefs submitted than I think any of the term.
And just for our listeners, sorry to interrupt,
Yes.
An amicus brief
Amicus brief is a brief in support of. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's officially translation friend of the court
Mm-hmm.
brief, right? And so it's intended to inform the court on the issues surrounding the case. It's not the main legal arguments, but other issues. And so institutions of higher education submitted amicus briefs.
HIAS Pennsylvania submitted
HIAS,
an amicus
you're right.
brief.
Many states and municipalities did.
Mhm.
Many sort of big industry, I believe Google and Apple both did. I'm not exactly sure on which,
Mhm.
but so there is a lot of support for DACA. But the arguments that the petitioner, the University of California, and the supporters of DACA were arguing was that DACA was an entirely lawful exercise of discretion, and the individuals relying on this promise of DACA status and relying on this promise of no retaliatory action being taken stepped forward and said, okay, here we are. You can find us, you can do it, we are here. And they relied on the promise of the security of work authorization and the promise of not being deported in doing that, putting not only sort of themselves potentially at risk, but also their family members, right? Because part of being a DACA recipient is often, right, you were brought here by your parents do not have status, and all of your family members are listed on your application. And so that's
another.
And so
reason.
it's a sort of question of the reliance, and therefore the president can't just terminate it, right? There has to be some recognition of this reliance before you take steps to terminate.
And what about, didn't the University of California specifically, as well as some of the other friends of the court, there were arguments made about the reliance of employers
Right.
on DACA recipients who were in their employ and who were doing fabulous things and, couldn't just be easily replaced because the government decided to change. Is that?
Certainly,
Yeah.
right. I mean, I think so. Industries were arguing we rely on the DACA recipients. They are, the best and the brightest is sort of how they're often referred to, right?
Mhm.
They are the best and the brightest. They are sort of champions of all of the industries in which they're in. They are valuable employees. They are valuable to our growth and our productivity. Same with the medical establishment, right? We've got doctors, we've got nurses, we've got other healthcare professionals who are DACA recipients upon whom we rely, and institutions of higher education as well, right? That the DACA recipients are again, really
Professors,
tremendous contributors to our community.
Yeah. Okay, great. And so what, if you're able, obviously no one has a crystal ball, but if you could explain to us either way, so if the Supreme Court finds in favor of the government, what do you think that will mean for DACA recipients?
That's a very good question, right? I think that is the question that everybody is asking. What will the court do, and what will happen if the court does not grant in favor of the DACA recipients, right, and allows this program to terminate? I think, again, in real terms, given the bureaucratic structures in place, I don't think that the bureaucracy has the capacity to affirmatively terminate DACA status for all DACA recipients. I think the more likely outcome is that people's DACA status, which is granted on a 2-year basis, will expire, and there will be no renewal opportunity for them, right? Because once they've got their work authorization, then they get their driver's license to sort of affirmatively target all 800,000 of those individuals, even though they know exactly where they live and everything, where they work and where they go to school. I think it's just again, both bureaucratically not really feasible and realistic, and politically
Problematic.
Politically very problematic. And so it would be sort of letting it just terminate on its own time. And then hopefully Congress will act.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was my next question. I mean, so is there a way to, if whether or not one would agree that President Obama had the authority or didn't have the authority, or the present government had the authority or didn't have the authority, is there something else that can be done?
So all of this is clearly within the authority of Congress, right? I mean, Congress can clearly make a decision about whether or not they want to grant a pathway to citizenship for people with longstanding presence in the United States. And so it is within their authority to pass a bill, whether it's amending the Immigration and Nationality Act or creating some other bill, right, to grant status, a lawful permanent resident status to individuals on DACA status. It has become increasingly partisan on Capitol Hill, despite the fact that in communities across the country, there is broad bipartisan support for the DACA students, so and DACA recipients. So, but I would hope that right now, I think Congress has been in this position of, well, the courts will take care of it. We don't have to go out on potentially a political limb. We don't have to do something where we're going to be accused by our opponents of being soft on immigration. And so we'll just let the courts handle this. But if the courts say, okay, we're out of this, right? And now this is Congress's duty, hopefully Congress will find a way to act.
To act, right.
They've brought it up at various times. They brought it up in the context of the border wall funding. And there, I think the problem there was that the DACA recipients themselves felt like they were being treated as pawns.
Right.
And so maybe this will create an opportunity for an independent evaluation, assessment, and passage of a bill on the merits of the DACA recipients themselves, as opposed to as a political trade-off.
Right. So we have a question from a listener, but it's related to my next question. So I will ask for the listener's patience. I want to ask this next question and then move into responding. So if the Supreme Court were to find in favor of the University of California, what do you think that Congress would then be like, okay, great, it's not our problem? Or where does that leave us?
I think it depends on what our next Congress looks like.
Okay.
Right? I think it absolutely depends on what our next Congress looks like. I think there are champions in Congress who recognize this is important for us to do, that this is a temporary solution. And in fact, when Sessions announced the termination, the whole argument behind the 6 months was we're going to give Congress 6 months to act before we terminate, right? And then the court stepped in, and so Congress did nothing at that point. And so I think if the courts rule in favor of the DACA recipients, I think Congress still has an obligation to act and provide some permanency and real security, because it's still a 2-year status, right? It's still a 2-year status,
and not a pathway to
and
citizenship.
can be threatened, seemingly threatened at any time, and not a pathway to citizenship. And you can't travel, you can't leave the United States with DACA status anymore. You've lost the ability to get parole. So your ability to do and grow, particularly students who want to participate in exchange students, people who are working, right? So much of work now involves international
right.
and global partnerships. And so your ability to fully participate in those is going to be limited. And so Congress does need to act.
Okay, so that then brings us to my next question, and also our listeners. So I was going to ask you, is there anything that individuals can do? And our listener asked, how can high school students specifically become involved as volunteers to help immigrants and DACA recipients?
Oh, there are a whole host of ways. I mean, I think the first and most important way is to stay informed, to be informed, to stay informed, and to share that information, right? The debates around immigration are often really lacking in grounding in facts.
Right.
And so being informed, it sounds very trite, but if you know a person, you're going to think differently about a person, right? And so it's always the conversation, well, but that's my, that's my best friend, right? And the whole DREAM Act came about because teachers who were not necessarily inclined to be favorable on matters of immigration were like, but this is my best student ever, and I've just found out that she can't go to college, right? And so it is that, and it is raising your voices and letting your voices be heard. Our high school students, most of them can't vote, but they can certainly do the legwork, right? They can do their legwork. They can make their voices heard. They can talk about how important it is to recognize people as people, and that that the DACA recipients are important members of our community. But the other piece of that sort of be informed and stay informed is also to recognize and be thoughtful and mindful about the narratives that we're using when we're talking about immigrants. And the DACA narrative has been problematic for a long time. And so it is the best and the brightest, they have no fault. They were brought here through no fault of their own. And what that often does is put blame on their parents, right? And their parents have done what all parents do. They have sought out better opportunities for their kids, right? And they have done what they need to do at often tremendous sacrifice, right? To ensure that their kids have important opportunities, sometimes to ensure that their kids can actually continue to live, right? In terms of what they might be confronting in their home country. So it is important also to recognize that our DACA recipients are members of communities that are mixed status communities and members of families that are mixed status communities. And all of those individuals in their community are valued members of their community. And so we want to be careful when we're talking about DACA that we are not inadvertently kind of blaming or demonizing the
parents or the non-DACA
recipients.
recipients, right? Well, so on that note, this is a little bit to the side of DACA and something we've talked about in previous Ask Me Anythings, but I think it bears repeating. So tell us a little bit about, people often say, well, okay, I don't want to demonize the parents, but why did they think they could just come here when they didn't have legal status? Don't they need to get in line and fill out whatever proper paperwork? So why are they not able to do that?
Because there's no line, right? And so while we are seeing sort of severe and harsh crackdowns on people who are in the United States without lawful status or presenting at the border without visas, we're also seeing huge delays in the lawful programs, right? Lawful residency programs or visa programs, we're seeing restrictions in those programs, right? Fewer and fewer people being granted, more limited eligibility, more restrictive eligibility requirements. And so the reality is that the majority of the individuals that we're talking about are people for whom there is no line to get into, right? There's this whole conversation about chain migration, right? And we need to stop chain migration because if you've got one family member, well, the reality is you've got to be a spouse, right? Or a child, right? You have to be an immediate family member. And even then, if you're an immediate family member, if you're a sibling, or if you're a child over the age of 21, you're going to be getting in a line. And depending on what country you're coming from and what the nature of that relationship is, you're going to be getting in a much longer line, right? And so people are not going to be alive when their number gets called for them. And so that's the reality, right? We are not talking about a system of immigration laws that reflects what our immigration laws looked like even 30 years ago, let alone 50 years ago, right? And so it's the sort of my parents did it or my grandparents did this, right? The laws were very different then.
Right.
And the options for coming and gaining status were very different then.
Right. I'll also just add, the perspective of whatever my parents or my grandparents did is from someone who was a child who heard stories, not someone who was an immigration lawyer who represented that person.
That too.
So that also distorts some of what the experience may or may not have been. Okay, great. And I want to add just one thing, circling back to the high schooler. You had mentioned that, of course, most high schoolers are not eligible to vote, but I do want to remind any of our listeners that, of course, high schoolers are potential voters. So they should never lose sight of that and recognize their own power and authority in contacting their representative and talking about the concern for legislation that is humane and also right for the United States. I think it can't be said enough. The economic contributions of DACA recipients, being authorized to work means that DACA recipients are authorized to work. And so they do, and they pay taxes and they contribute. And, losing those members of the workforce would be devastating to the American economy, not to mention the individual businesses who rely on their staff. So contacting Congress is a really important and helpful thing for every individual to do. So particularly if you have the potential to vote.
I think that's right? It is making your voices heard. The reality is that when there is immigration legislation, just like when there's anything that deals with international human rights, or the anti-voices are so much louder, right? They may not be more plentiful, but they are louder. And the reality is that there are a lot of causes, there are a lot of issues, and people get distracted, right? And so it's important to sort of keep your eye on the ball, right? There isn't anything pending in Congress right now on DACA. We have to worry about climate change. We're worried, there are a lot of things that people want to have their voices heard about, and they should, right? And this needs to sort of stay one of them, because Congress won't act unless they feel the pressure to act.
Right. Okay, so thank you so much for those enlightening answers. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. For all of you who sent questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, they will be answered in the comments below. We ask that you stay tuned for HIAS Pennsylvania's next Ask Me Anything, as we will be discussing the current presidential candidate's stances on immigration, although the date has not been set yet. As always, you can learn more on how to support DACA recipients, asylum seekers, and other immigrants and refugees at www.hiaspa.org. Thank you.